So I'm glad to be talking again with Landon Loftin and Max Leyf, who have written this great book to a very great thinker, Owen Barfield, their book, What Barfield Thought. My own interest came together in a book as well, with a book called The Secret History of Christianity, Jesus, the Last Inkling and the Evolution of Consciousness, which, for those in the know, is a clear reference to the Inkling group that Barfield was part of, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien being the famous members of that. But Barfield having his own voice and also interest in other parts of the thinking world, not least that of Rudolf Steiner. But hi there again. And I really enjoyed the conversation last time. So look on my channel if you didn't see that already. But we could pick up again today, perhaps, with what is towards the end of your book, the end of my book, partly because it's the direction of travel that Barfield himself was going on, which is around this notion of final participation. I wonder whether one of you two would like to just tell us what final participation is, in maybe first of all in Barfield's kind of schema, and then we'll try and dive more deeply into actually what he meant by it in itself. But why final? Why participation? Would one of you like to pick that up?
Sure. Yeah, so in the introduction to our book, we provisionally described Barfield's theory of the evolution of consciousness as this journey from ancient people having this, what Barfield described as participation in the life of nature. And it's sort of a mode of consciousness in which there's this sort of felt communion with all the things around, such that people perceived the world as having an inherent significance, to the modern day, where our consciousness has changed such that rather than being conscious participants in the life of nature, we're like self-conscious observers of nature. And so idolatry is the term, for reasons that Barfield explains, that he chooses to describe the mode of consciousness, the kind of perception that we have today. And because we are idolatrous, in the sense that Barfield stipulates, we don't see the natural world, we don't see the world around us as having an inherent significance, as if it's a collection of inert objects for us to manipulate for our own purposes. And
hence idols. The shortcut is, and hence idols. That's where the idolatry link comes in. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And so for Barfield, there's one advantage that's come with our idolatrous consciousness, which is that we are self-conscious. We're aware of ourselves as living, distinguished individual beings. And with that comes a certain kind of freedom. And Barfield doesn't think that we should try to go back to the original participation, but yet we are, as he uses the analogy, we're like Odin, who's gained our sophistication at the cost of an eye. We become myopic in our view of the world, and he wants us to regain what we've lost without losing what we've gained. So becoming not only self-conscious observers of nature, but again, self-conscious participants in the life of nature.
And that involvement of the self is really important, isn't it? Max, you want to pick up from there?
Yeah, I'd love to just kind of add to and comment on a couple points that Landon brought up. And I guess I'll start with the last thing he said about how self-consciousness, it's like it's the pearl of great price. It's something that was won at the expense of this kind of, probably the best way to say it actually is an eviction from the Garden of Eden. I would imagine that the clearest way to try to convey what Barfield is inviting us to consider is to just return to the original Genesis myth. And you just consider like this evolution or trajectory of humanity from what Barfield described, or excuse me, what Landon described, and Barfield presents as original participation, in which our basically like our behaviors and our ends and our desires and the actions that we take, they're more or less they just arise in us as a function of what we today term instinct. And you imagine that all the other creatures in nature they never experience that kind of you know, eviction, I guess, or alienation from their instincts in a way that it's like a self-evident item of experience for us, that we can, I mean, we can certainly, we follow our instincts and we act upon them in many contexts, but it's just as obvious that we can actually like stand apart from them and scrutinize them and resist them if we so choose. And that's the rift, I guess, the function that allows for, I mean, on the one hand, it kind of curses us with this feeling of again, alienation, or what Landon described as the kind of standing outside of the world, looking in, feeling like not like a participant, but just like an onlooker, a spectator. But as Landon also indicated, like it's that same that's the price, or that's the cost for this like latent germinal possibility for something new. And that can be described as freedom on one hand, which Landon said, and then also final participation on the other hand. And those might seem like different things, but I think it's worth just considering how those might be two different words for what is ultimately one thing. And I'll maybe just like give a couple just like invitations to consider further, and if one of you wants to pick up on this. But when we think about freedom, the first thing that often comes to people's minds is like a lack of external constraint, or lack of coercion, or lack of, you know, being compelled to do something. And the trouble with that is it even if it might be a necessary condition for freedom, it's definitely not a sufficient one. And the reason for that is, in order to like truly exercise freedom, not only do you have to be, you know, like at liberty to perform some action, but you also have to two things also have to be in place. One is you have to know what you're doing. Like you have to have some understanding and conception of the consequences of that action. It makes no sense to say I'm going to do something and I have no idea what I'm doing and I have no idea what the consequences are, and nevertheless I'm going to do it freely. That's more a description of like just kind of arbitrariness than any kind of real freedom. The idea of a free decision is that it has to somehow flow from the kind of like core, the essence of you as an individual. And the other thing about freedom is we have to, and so we have to, in some sense, like understand, have knowledge. Knowledge is a condition for freedom. And the thing about freedom is we have to be able to, this is the second point, in a way that's different from all the other creatures in nature. We have to be able to like identify our own ends. That's the thing about instinct. When we say instinct, it's something for which the end of the action, or the desire, the telos, or the good towards which it's striving, it's like it's been predetermined, it's foregone. It's something that has been inherited by, you know, just through nature. For human beings, this is something totally different. And for, you know, for better or for worse, can be extremely destructive when people are able to just, you know, in a kind of sometimes nihilistic way, just choose these ends that are harmful to themselves and others. But it's that same, you know, it's that same capacity that can be turned into something new in this world, which is this sort of, you know, what Barfield terms final participation. And it's a way of actually like collaborating with Christ in the economy of creation. So I'll leave it there and just
it's a good point to end, because it is, as you say, kind of like an invitation. You know, my part of my mind goes to, but what does this mean? You know, a rather sort of blunt kind of question, and there's at least clues which you draw out, which feel very different kind of clues. One is quite an abstract discussion of the nature of consciousness, almost, you know, and the fact that we aren't just aware, but can become self-aware. And there's something about stepping, I always feel like it's a stepping back almost into that self-awareness, which is linked to this notion, as you say, of knowledge and freedom, of our goals, our telos. But another very different mode of language would refer to Christ and Christianity. And there's something about the person of Christ that is witnessed to, say, in the biblical tradition, and then I think particularly in mystical forms of Christianity, that too gives us some sort of maybe more felt sense rather than abstract sense of what this final participation might be like. And now, if that's a fair characterization, do you want to pick it up from there again?
I'd like to, in fact, yes, there's something I think really crucial, Mark, that you touched on. If we really want to think about freedom uh, and think it through thoroughly, we'll arrive at the conclusion that the only ultimately free being is God. And so we are only free insofar as we take part in God's nature and Christ. And the reason I say that, again, it goes back to the original point about knowledge. Like, none of us actually knows the final and ultimate consequences of anything we do. And so this is not actually a question of it's not a question of establishing a false dichotomy between either we're free or we're not free. This is a question of degrees of freedom, which is the same question as degrees of participation in Christ. And it's only God who's free, because only God really has that, synoptic vision of everything that can possibly come, and both through time and through causality and through space.
Landon, do you want to continue?
Sure. Well, I'm going to rewind for a second, and I want to go back to the first thing Max said, which was about this idea that it's that the journey from participation to idolatry or onlooker consciousness, or whatever term we use to describe the sort of consciousness that characterizes modernity. Barfield himself compares that to the fall from Eden, the fall from paradise, being expelled from Eden. And he even makes the comment that these myths that have some kind of fall from a primeval paradisal state that you find not just in the Hebrew Bible, but elsewhere across the world, they all have their origin, Barfield thinks, in this fact that people have been dimly aware that their consciousness has changed such that they've become isolated to some degree from the world in which they live. And then, of course, that got worse and worse as time went on. But I think that's interesting and important as we make the connection to Barfield's theological vision, because he makes a point to say that final participation is not something that's inevitable. It seems that there was that the movement from original participation to, the consciousness of the modern world, there was something kind of inevitable about it, that as language developed and abstract thought, this was almost like a byproduct of things that just had to happen. Yet final participation is not the same. It's not inevitable. It involves our free choices, our initiative to open ourselves up to things that we are habitually closed off to as a result of this barrier of abstractions and things that keeps us from having a real contact with, Barfield uses the language of concrete reality. He doesn't just mean, physical world. He means the physical world understood for what it is and not as, just a collection of inert objects. And so for him, he warns against this, like, treating final participation in apocalyptic terms, that it's inevitable, it's going to come upon us, it's our destiny. And he's a little bit more skeptical, and he says, this is the direction I hope we'll all be moving. And yet, because of the freedom that's been enabled by the self-consciousness that we've gained through this process, it is to some degree up to us to freely choose to participate in that. And that's what Christ invites us to do on his, I think, very provocative interpretation of some of the things that Christ did and said.
Do you think it's fair
People
to
are
say
also
that...
free to.
Oh.
I would just to add to something that Landon said. People are also free to basically, like, indenture their souls to the demons now, and you see that in the way, like, imagine when nature sets our ends and our desires. There's a kind of like harmony to it within the whole economy of creation, when suddenly you have, like, marketing campaigns and propaganda and politicians, by process of inception, like, seeding these desires and these demonic aims into people, then that shows the stakes of how this is not something that's just foregone. It's something that we really are kind of tasked to like Landon said, put forth this special initiative and try to undertake.
I mean, I was going to wonder whether Barfield and certainly strands within the Christian tradition anyway feel that it's paradoxically perhaps there is a genuine freedom and openness in terms of final participation, but at the same time there's only one destination as well, so that there can be mistakes, errors, very tragic, even demonic experiences and even phases of time in societies and civilizations. And yet, because Christ to him is not just, as it were, an isolated human being that happened to get it right, but is part of the nature of reality too. The logos would be the Christian word, that something has been set into history that will, one way or another, never let up on drawing us, even if people and times and places refuse the allure. And so another way of putting it would be that if you reflect on the nature of freedom, and as you said there, that only God is truly free, another way of putting that would be that our freedom is found in sort of maximal being, if you like, because only when we're fully realized can we fully be free. The idea that freedom is the choosing of one choice over another then starts to look really rather narrow and limited. And so, as the early church fathers who Barfield knew, I think it was maybe Maximus the Confessor, but one of them certainly puts it like this, that we're created to become uncreated. And the story of that is full of contingencies, but there's a kind of a necessary direction of travel at the same time. And so Barfield, can talk about the fall in the same way that some traditions have talked about the happy fault. He even ends, I think, Saving the Appearances, his great book, with the happy idolatry, I think it is the phrase. And so there's a sense in which it's both and, rather than a real contingency like it might just not happen.
It's Felix Eidolon.
Thank you very much. He puts it in the Latin.
Yeah, I think he's also alluding to Augustine's famous
the Felix Culpa, yeah.
Felix Culpa. Oh, happy sin.
Yeah.
Mark, I think you touched on this, like, really the heart of like what's at stake, because when you alluded to the what seems to be a paradox between freedom of choice, the first thing that occurs to us is like multiplicity of choice. We would think the more free I am, the more choices I have. But then simultaneously, it's like the more free we are, the more that it seems to converge on on basically following Christ in some way. And those seem almost like reverse movements. But I think the reason it appears as a paradox is because we haven't really like truly considered the way that freedom interfaces with the logos and the structure of creation. And there's like at least two things to consider. And one is that, again, we might think that the more free we are, the more choices we have, but that doesn't account for the fact that we only perform an action. Like, our will is only this is axiomatic. Like, we don't do something because we think it's bad. We do something because we think because we perceive the goodness of it. And this goes back to Plato's idea of the good, and he treats that as like the kind of holy grail and the summum bonum of philosophy. It's to achieve an adequate idea of the good. Why does that matter? Well, the reason is because in our entire life is like a manifestation of our tacit idea of the good. So again, in other words, when we come to a moment of crisis and we have to make some decision or another decision, this is not a question of like, oh, I wonder if this is the case. This like follows by definition of the terms. We always we always make the decision according to our idea of the good and our perception of what is best in that decision. The three of us, there's no other reason that we're all three here together right now today is because we perceive this as the best thing we could be doing right now at this moment. And axiomatically, if there were something other that we could be doing that we each perceived as better, then, one of us, we would be absent from this discussion. And so then you see like what freedom really means is not just arbitrary multiplication and diversification of choices. No. It means the ability to choose the good, which you can't do without knowledge. But you can turn that to its inverse and say the extent to which we're incapable of doing the good is the same extent to which we are unfree. And so that what seems to be a paradox is actually just kind of like essentially contained within the nature of and the definition of these terms. And then you think of like how does Christ play into this, and why does it not? Why is this? It almost starts to sound like necessity. And then you think why does that not conflict with the idea of freedom? And the answer is because of what both of you have already in some way alluded to. It's like nature compels actions, but Christ never compels actions. Christ invites us to actions. And if you think of like different tiers of causality, you can imagine mechanical causality. And that's like when, one stone strikes another stone and imparts this movement to it. Or, people can, if somebody again coerces you or with like forces your hand or something, this is like kind of brute, gross mechanical causality. And it's not like, it's almost as though the concept of freedom doesn't even belong within that tier of causality. It's like there's a certain like order or again ecology of concepts within that like paradigm of mechanical causality, and freedom just like doesn't belong there. We can imagine a second tier of causality, and here I'm just kind of, this is like a model or schema heuristic, but I do think it points to something that is observable in our experience, which is there's another kind of causality which is in a certain sense more free than the gross mechanical kind, but it's not free in the final sense. And what I have in mind here is like emotional causality. It's when and this is by the way, this is like the modus operandi of marketing campaigns and propaganda, like I alluded to. They're not exactly like mechanically coercing you to do something, but nevertheless, they're instilling these desires into you and manipulating you in that way, fostering this sense of like, again, sympathy or antipathy, pleasure or aversion. And again, that's not like exactly compulsion, but it's kind of compulsion because it's something that you, again, that sort of comes upon you in a more or less subliminal way, the way our feelings arise in us. But then imagine a third tier of causality. And that is kind of like this limpid clarity about here's what's at stake. Here's my reasons for acting. And this is when this is the gesture of Christ. It's always an invitation in that way. Christ doesn't compel anybody to follow him. He invites people to follow him. But those people, which is us, we make that decision.
Nicely put. I hesitate to introduce this figure because I think that there were differences between them actually, but it sounds a bit like Carl Jung's synchronicity, where Jung argues that synchronicity is not just a sort of random coincidence, as it's often taken to be, but is actually the dynamic of the cosmos itself, based on that which draws through allure or sympathy or evocation, and mechanical causality is just a sort of small subset of that, where the sympathy sort of disappears and feels just like a push and pull. But I think, at least in that area, there are links between Barfield and what Jung was trying to get towards as well. But I like the analogy there of advertising, because that brings it very much into direct experience, and the promise that your life will be fuller if you have this thing, and the way that's presented in emotional terms is a kind of perversion of the promise of of Christ, reality itself. Yeah, I think that's very helpful, actually.
So we got here by talking about the question about whether or not final participation was inevitable. And you, Dr. Vernon, suggested that maybe it's inevitable in a sense, but we have this freedom that allows us to resist or take a more difficult path. But eventually, in the grand scheme of things, this purpose will be accomplished, this divine purpose, as it were. And I'm just curious. We got into a discussion of the nature of freedom. And in many ways, I'm very much moved by this conception of freedom as the ability to do the good. But does this imply that, as Plato pointed out, that all vice or sin is the result of ignorance of what is in fact good? And if it does, that raises some concerns that might be applied here about this final participation. Is it completely ignorance that keeps us from entering in to this new and fuller state of consciousness, or is it somehow a free act in the sense that we could but we choose not to? We have the knowledge, because that rings more true to my experience. So I don't want to take it too far afield, but those are the questions that come to my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know quite. Well, maybe this is a Barfieldian way of putting it. But I think maybe another element that you have to factor in here is the sense of your individuality, what you think your individuality is. Barfield makes a lot of play on the notion of being able to say I am as an individual, but then this also being a name of God in the Hebrew Bible. And of course, Christ in John's Gospel uses the phrase I am several times to illuminate the meeting of the human individuality and capacity to say I am with the divine name I am. And maybe where this links with what you're raising there is that if you can be ignorant or deluded about the nature of your identity as well. And so that combined with ignorance about the good, maybe that then makes for this active kind of freedom of choice in an erroneous direction. Because if you just have the idea that that evil is ignorance of the good, it rather leaves the individual sort of a bit passive, and as if they're waiting to be told what the good really is. Whereas actually, our sense of ourselves is at play here too. And so discovering who we really are, I think must be another sort of facet of this move towards a final participation.
That's right. I think if you had the total, like, omniscient divine knowledge, you would never perform anything other than the good and what will ultimately lead you to cleave with Christ. And but you're pointing to something like a legitimate problem, Landon. And so this is not a question of saying that's not how it is. This is like you're pointing to a self-evident datum of experience. And then it's for us, what we're really doing is much less what it might seem like, which is like trying to figure out whether evil is the same thing as ignorance. It's more a question of there are these again like patterns and phenomena of experience, and we're trying to find the best way of describing them and characterizing them, basically articulating them. And the question for us is it more coherent to describe it in the first way or the second way? To describe it in the sort of, again, Platonic way, or more like Augustinian way, which is people can know the good and still do the evil. They're talking about the same thing, but they're articulating it or choosing to conceptualize it in different ways. And so I don't think there's a correct answer in the sense of like we would just stumble on the right answer. It's out there for us to go and search for, like forensically or something. It's more a question of recognizing what's at stake and finding a harmonious and coherent way of articulating it.
And maybe also we need to factor in that this is a state of creation and not just a state of the individual mind. There's ignorance itself is in a kind of state. Creation itself is in a kind of state of ignorance, and you know, linking back to the ontological significance of Christ and not just the epistemological significance of Christ. So, you know, hence St. Paul could say something like, you know, I will what I can't do and do what I don't want to do, and so on. He puts it nicer than that in the King James Version anyway.
I should perform that which is good I find not, for the evil which I would, that I do, and the good that I would, that I do not. But if I do what I would not, then is I not I that do it, but sin which dwelleth in me.
Yeah, so this notion of sin, and again, maybe that's been rather privatized in the modern world, whereas actually, you know, for Paul and the New Testament, and for much of the Christian period anyway, it's a state of nature rather than just aberrations in the human mind.
Yeah, and
this is probably common knowledge, but really sin is like the archery term, arrow that misses the mark.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a really good point, because we don't build our own consciousness from the ground up, right? We inherit it through enculturation and the acquisition of language, and that's how we come to possess the consciousness to one degree or another that's characteristic of our age. And so in by the same token, it's not simply up to individuals to choose to to move in the direction that Barfield would have us move. Individuals can play a part, and that's fortunate for us. But if we think of it in less individual terms and more cosmic terms,
and there's an interesting. Well, I'm just going to observe. There's an interesting anniversary that we just passed. It was on Thursday. On that Thursday, I think it was the 5th. Yeah, 5th of October. In 869 AD was the 8th Ecumenical Council convened. Fourth Council of Constantinople, and it's, you know, there's all these politics that was behind the convention, but there's Rudolf Steiner like repeatedly actually points to this as something like watershed moment in the conception of consciousness and the mind. And before that time, the nous was this sort of idea of cosmic mind in Greek. The intellect in Latin was thought of as something in every way analogous to the way when we take a breath, we inspire from the atmosphere and then return that same air to the atmosphere, but the atmosphere is common. It's something that we all partake in. So in the same way, before that point, nous was thought of, like cosmic mind, was thought of as something like, it wasn't thought that all of your like conceptions and ideas and consciousness experience was just transpiring inside of your cranium. Definitely not. It was thought of as in every way analogous to how we draw a breath from the common atmosphere. So too, we draw a breath, we draw thoughts, we draw experience, we draw consciousness from nous. But Steiner points to this is it's the 11th canon, actually, for anyone who wants to look into this, of the 8th Ecumenical Council. And what it's doing is identifying this heresy. It says anyone who thinks there's two souls, an intellectual soul and a rational soul, which is basically intellectual is ordinary translation of nous in Greek. Rational is ordinary translation of dianoia, I think. And they're saying, let that person be anathema, anyone who thinks there's two souls. And again, it seems like a kind of political and kind of like a insignificant statement. But Steiner actually repeatedly identifies that as just the significance that it had. It really marked this change, more of like a subjectification of nous, to the point that it's, at our time, he says before that time, the anthropological paradigm was threefold. The human beings participate in nature below, and they participate in spirit above, and then they have a psyche in the middle. And Steiner says after that time, the anthropological paradigm was more or less conceived as twofold, body and soul. And everything that before was a function of spirit was either discarded or appropriated to the soul.
Yeah, so there's a kind of collapse of a vertical dimension into the horizontal. And so, I mean, I always think it's worth reflecting a bit on the nature of language when talking about Barfield, because language was sort of his way into all this, and reflecting on how language changes meaning, being words as fossils of consciousness, and hence revealing the evolution of consciousness. And I think that one of the ways that you can put what you just said there, Max, in another way is how we experience language itself. And were very inclined to think that, you know, we possess language, and so we use its symbols and signs and so on to communicate our desires or our feelings, or convey our awareness and knowledge of the world, whatever the way we might be using language. Whereas Barfield, I think, was alert to actually, it's much more like language speaks us. Much like in the parallel you just meant there, dianoia is a sort of reflection of nous, the much wider inspiring. And again, you know, so for Barfield, language is, I think you can put it like this, it's definitely human, but it's a human way of participating in a cosmic language. And so our particular language has its origins and indeed its vitality, its soul, because it participates in this wider logos again. And so in a way, you might, I'm just thinking a bit on my feet now, but if one learned to experience one's own speaking as part of the divine speech, in some, you know, no doubt rarefied and stumbling way, but the sense that, well, actually, you know, Leonard Cohen's famous line that every word contains a blaze of light, something like that in the famous song Alleluia. You know, I think that is to begin to get a sense of what final participation might be. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I think words are, for those who are attentive to them, one of the places where we still have the vestigial remains of original participation, that we don't yet see them as simply you know, inert objects or processes, or however you want to think about what words are. We see them as inherently meaningful. We see through them to the significance that they express, in the same way we see that in like the human face. I think people naturally, spontaneously see it as something that expresses some kind of, you know, meaning. It has a you know, a resonance of something that is spiritually significant. And so words are a good place for us to, I think, experience what has largely been lost to our perception in other ways, and then through that give us a foothold, as it were, to begin our journey to ascend the mountain, as it were, of final participation.
Yeah,
The
Matt.
steep and rugged ascent, as Plato calls it, out of the cave. It is like language was a certainly a doorway for Barfield into higher levels of participation. I think it can be for a lot of us, for the reason that Landon mentioned. Like, if you look at a page of text, unless, I mean, as long as you're literate and as long as the language is familiar to you, you really do like see the sensory phenomenon there on the page is transparent to your mind, and you don't really see the shapes of, you know, the glyphs and the letters that are etched onto the page. You really do like see through them into this basically like spiritual dimension. And you know, so I do think like language is it's something that's so ready at hand and so immediate for us as an entry point into higher participation. And you know, that's what we should expect. Think of the very beginning of Genesis. God is speaking creation into being, and you know, we're called to you know, begin to collaborate with God.
And I also like that in a fairly rare moment, it must be said, in Barfield, he does talk about personal experience in this regard, and which is illuminating as an example when he talks about he falling into depression in his early 20s, and it was poetry that rescued him from his depression, and a very serious suicidal depression, he says. But the reason why poetry rescued him wasn't just that he felt the words of a poem gave him a way of communicating his own, you know, feelings, but actually he was able to do something slightly deeper, which is to realize that meant that words themselves carry a kind of energy that wasn't his own, and if he could, whilst reading the poem, also be aware of that movement of energy through him, then that provided him, well, maybe, you know, a path up a rugged ascent, and difficult, because it does require a kind of retuning or realigning of your sense of what you're doing when you're reading, and particularly poetry, and to be aware of things at kind of both levels. Maybe a bit, it's not quite a poem's not dianoia, but nonetheless a return to the sort of being inspired by the poem, not just in the sense that your private feelings or thoughts get a bit of a lift, but that you're participating in that which is the origin of the inspiration or the lift.
Yeah, I think that's important regarding that experience, that Barfield wasn't just finding poetic words to express how he was feeling and, therefore having some kind of cathartic experience. He had the felt change of consciousness that he describes in poetic diction, which allowed him to not only perceive a larger and fuller world, but like reforge the connections between his own soul and the things that he loved and admired about the world. And so that experience in particular, he describes the lead up to it as, inside of me, I felt something so burningly alive, but outside of me was just all of these dead objects moving in fixed accord with the laws of nature. And that poetry allowed him to connect that sense of what was burningly alive within himself with things outside of himself. And that was
yeah, thank you for that. I'm really glad that we're sort of talking a bit experientially about final participation as well as abstractly, because I think it's something that ultimately you need to have it shown to you rather than just be told, and then you kind of get the feel for it, or the love for it. And maybe love isn't quite a Barfieldian word, I don't think, but nonetheless that's sort of an important element in this.
You need to have two things.
Yeah.
You need to have the right idea and the experience. And if you only have one of those things but not the other one, you really miss the mark, and you won't have the complete phenomenon of final participation. Because people presumably experience it all the time, but they don't recognize it. They don't have the concepts that allow them to see it for what it is.
Max, I think that is a good way of setting a foundation for Barfield's criticism of like modernist poets like T.S. Eliot. That
I was about to read "The fire and the rose are one," as you said about the burning inside me. All manner of things shall be well when the tongues of flame are enfolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one.
Yeah. Good.
So, and that's a nod to Dante, of course, the fire and the rose. The descent and the ascent as well. Yeah.
Then can you carry that forward though? The idea about the Barfield's criticism of the modernist poets. I think that's an important point.
Well, it's not just the modernist poets. I think Barfield often sees people who have the right impulses and maybe an intuition that things are not how they should be, that human consciousness is such that we are incapable of fulfilling our nature in a certain way because we're disconnected from the world, and yet they don't have the knowledge component. And so this is where you get almost to an annoying degree Barfield's insistence. Okay, here's somebody who's on the right track, but it's not quite, so they should read Rudolf Steiner. You see it throughout his essays. Half of them end. And here's as far as I'll take you. Now you need to read Rudolf Steiner to get the full picture, because that's just how he saw it. And so, I mean, I don't know that I could go into too much detail off the cuff about the modernist poets, but I think it's the lack of knowledge combined with the right impulses that makes them a particular target of Barfield's frustration.
Well, I also think they're like just kind of living and breathing in the atmosphere of modernism, which it sees freedom not as this like extraordinary possibility to contribute and for creativity. It sees it rather. So it doesn't see freedom as like the possibility to be creative. It sees freedom as something like nihilistic and something abysmal. And there's like no way to escape that entire tenor of modernism.
Do you think that things have changed though in the decades since Barfield wrote such things, and And maybe now, he wouldn't have to make a slightly gnomic appeal to Steiner, but would feel perhaps that there's more material in the wider culture, since modernity is now so widely critiqued, to flesh it out in his own voice. I mean, I sort of hope so, really. Partly because I have to confess that, the nod to Steiner I don't find it actually that helpful, because I don't actually find it on the whole that illuminating, or at least it stays very abstract and, esoteric. So I wonder whether maybe this is, to put it another way, whether this actually, at least maybe in the margins of our culture now, something of this is actually appearing as modernity and its assumptions dissolve in some measure, at least.
Yeah, well, Max and I make a note in our book about postmodernism, this broad, vague term we use to describe, all this sort of constellation of views and cultural movements that are associated with the dissolution of modernity. And we don't make any rigorous attempt to define that or anything. But I think Max and I agreed, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that it's not really, while some of the criticisms of the assumptions that have driven the modern world are important and helpful that we get out of postmodern thought and culture, it's not really offered us like a viable alternative. It seems to just be good on the criticism for the most part, from my perspective. And so I would like to think that we live in a world where there's maybe more broadly accessible a culture that supports the kind of changes that we want to make in ourselves and in our world, and that we want to see manifested as a result of these kinds of changes. It's not obvious to me, but I'm also very wary about saying anything much about the present. So
where I might turn to for at least a kind of glimmer of hope would be saying, in at least some parts of discussion about Christianity in the West, where it feels like there's much more openness to mystical traditions, maybe the Christianity of the East, actually. And this has happened because theologians, at least a few, I'm thinking of, quite well-known figures like Rowan Williams, for example, or David Bentley Hart, John Milbank, Sarah Coakley, perhaps, Janet Martin Soskis. She just wrote an interesting book on the names of God that feels like it's nudging in this direction. And what, in a way, they've because the modern assumptions about how to do theology, looking for evidence, trying to find rational support, and feeling the pull of theology needing to comply with scientific speculation, it's created a kind of free space where a sort of orthodoxy can return. And that orthodoxy, by which I mean picking up particularly on these inner traditions within Christianity, it needs to work out what it means to return. But nonetheless, there is the space for it to return. So words like participation, which perhaps were quite niche Barfieldian kind of words back in the 1950s when he was using it, now are quite broadly used, actually. And it remains to be fully described what a return of participation might mean. But nonetheless, the effort is underway, I think.
Yeah, so if the modern world is a synthesis and the postmodern world is an antithesis, I think if we have the resynthesizing at the end, there might be a lot of promise there for people to be open and receptive to the sorts of things that Barfield advocates for when he talks about final participation. But yeah, I'm just not sure personally, how it'll all shake out, and I'm not sure either that I know enough about the modern world. But a lot of those thinkers you mentioned, I also think of somebody like Ian McGilchrist, which I know not all Barfield enthusiasts are divided about him. Is he more like, James, who wrote that book that Barfield had a brilliant critique of, or is he doing something different? And I happen to find McGilchrist's work fascinating, and not above criticism, but I really enjoy it. And I think that there's a lot of promise there too, not just in his work, but in the wide appeal that it has. I think people intuitively understand he's on to something, that this, as he would describe it, left brain dominance has shaped our world and has shaped us such that we are living lives that are sort of on the surface of what human beings are really meant to be and to do. And so, yeah, I think there is promise.
Max.
Um, yeah, thank you both. And I think that's an important question. It's like Barfield and then even going back to Steiner, they made this appeal to all of us and to the modern world, the contemporary world. And the question is whether that appeal has been in any way heeded. And I think it's really illuminating to point to these different figures. I would say, and everyone that you mentioned, I would second. I'm really, between the three of us, I'm really like an unapologetic anthroposopher. And so when Barfield makes these comments to Steiner, I feel he could be taking words out of my own mouth. But I understand that it's not for everyone, and that's one of the reasons that I appreciate Barfield so much, is that he makes a certain portion of Steiner's teachings so much more accessible, certainly to English speaking audience. One thing that's happened since Barfield's time is like substantially more of Steiner's lectures and texts have actually been translated into English. So this is also a change. Um, but I would say like the question of whether I really appreciate the way Landon laid out the like dialectic between modernism and postmodernism. Obviously, it's like a recapitulation of a similar analogous dialectic between the Enlightenment period in Europe and then the Romantic reaction to it. These again are like, and this is the familiar phrase to many Barfield enthusiasts. The idea of what Barfield is actually calling for is the kind of romanticism come of age. There's something puerile about romanticism, but it contains the seeds of great potential. And I think the same could be said really about postmodernism. There's something in the way, like Landon said it very well. It's like all it can do is just tear down things and criticize and just be cynical. But what again, like it contains what is, I think, the possibility that we're all seeking. It's like the sense of individual creativity, really, and the idea that things are not just like given to us deterministically. We have to put something forth and be creative and call forth these like nuanced and analogical relationships between what seem like disparate phenomena. I really think we can imagine something like postmodernism come of age, and that gives us at least a kind of program for direction we would hope to carry things. And then as to whether the world is in fact proceeding in that direction that we might hope, I'm kind of like Landon, a little bit agnostic, but I would also say, when we conceptualize that question and conceptualize the world and wonder which direction it's going, sorry to say, but I mean, not sorry to say, I'm pleased to say that we have to include this very conversation within that our picture of the world. And so one thing we can say for sure is there's three of us convening together to talk about this, and that's also part of the world.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. These things emerge between us, not just within us isolated ways. But I'm very fascinated by this expression, romanticism come of age. And I wonder whether you would buy this sort of twist to this notion, which is that a romanticism come of age is not just focusing on creativity as if it's a broadly positive endeavor, kind of riding the imagination to bring into manifestation in some way, nor is it just a kind of expression of feeling and staying with a kind of yearning or a longing, which I think was part of Barfield's critique of a poet like Wordsworth, but that it's actually a giving yourself to that which you are feeling. And so this is what it is to follow this inner energy or this Christ direction of travel, it's not just the sort of expression that dianoia. It is almost, I don't know quite what the words would be, made like a plunge back into nous, but that is sacrificial, and is a kind of emptying that leads to a fullness. And so romanticism come of age is not just loving love, but would be dying for love, for example. Or you might say that it's following Christ all the way, actually. And that means that Christ's actions in life, and maybe some of the parables too, where Christ is free because Christ can give himself into this wider life. But nonetheless, it is a dying. And so we need to also factor in that this path towards final participation involves a kind of passing away. I think part of the caution around is culture nudging in this direction or not. I completely share that hesitation, partly because it's impossible to say really, but also because I think there's a deeper truth here, which is that heaven is not actually a place on earth. That the earth must pass away, itself must re-participate with all the change in the divine life. And so that does mean that life as we know it is going to change, is going to be transformed. Again, Paul alludes to this both at the individual level, but also at the cosmic level. And so I wonder what you make of that, that romanticism come of age needs this sense of the passing away, the dying, the giving, the kenotic, and would be a more Christian way of putting it, taking that seriously too.
I think that's absolutely right. Like one of the elements of romanticism that's somewhat childish is the kind of like tendency towards almost just like brooding, with introspective brooding, this sort of drawing inwards and becoming almost like Narcissus, just like fascinated by the images of your own imagination and your own emotions. And it's that same that but nevertheless it has something important. It's touching this nerve of creativity and spirit and psyche. And I think it's just like you said, Mark, that the task then is to turn that outwards, not only inwardly but also outwardly into the world.
So, but Max, maybe I could ask you now, I've got you here. Does that resonate with what Steiner is saying? So when Barfield nods to Steiner, is that the kind of thing that he's nodding towards?
Oh, without a doubt. And Steiner goes so far, like he's always giving actually like exercises, actually, cognitive and meditative exercises that try to, in his mind, I picture somebody who's has this capacity and he's trying to devise ways of it's not something that can just be pointed out to people. It's something that has to be kind of fostered and then developed in people. But I would say absolutely. And he's he describes actually these states of consciousness that are related to waking consciousness in the same way that dreaming consciousness is related to it, which is to say, it's fundamentally different state of consciousness that we in some ways like can have a foot in and do have a foot in, but maybe don't recognize it. He has a whole series of exercises that are geared towards developing this capacity in people.
And would that include a kind of a rising up within you of a wider consciousness, rather than just a sort of self-salvation, a kind of effort to bring it about? Because that always feels to me important distinction to make, that sometimes when people talk about practices and exercises, it can feel like if you only struggle to sort of get it, then you might be able to sustain it. When actually, and again, I sense this is a deep truth that lies in many spiritual traditions, that paradoxically the effort is to come to a point of no effort, and to realize that this flow, if you like, or this life, this logos, this light, this love, was there all along.
Oh, without a doubt, Steiner, like he has this schema um, of like further states of consciousness beyond ordinary waking consciousness. And the first one he calls imagination, but he always and so he has exercises that are geared towards fostering that ability in us to basically transform knowledge we have into images. And you imagine somebody like illustrating a text. Imagine Plato conceiving of the allegory of the cave. This is when we talk about the spiritual world, we're talking about something that doesn't have like sensory aspects in the way that we're used to when we talk about obviously this sensory world. But nevertheless, there are this analogizing power, the power of metaphor. It allows us to basically transpose elements from one world to the other world. And so that first direction, like from formlessness into form, that Steiner terms that imagination. But he cautions always, he says, like, imaginations are always going to be subjective. And so don't believe them. But he says the imagination, that state of consciousness, he terms imagination, it actually prepares you for the second movement, the next gesture, which is actually, and he warns you, he says, it's one thing to bring a thought to your mind and then release the thought, but it's something like very different to have, basically created something, worked hard, arduously to create an image, and then entirely cast it from your mind. And he says it gets sticky or something if we've put that kind of work into it. But he says it's necessary. You have to do that. And only that sort of letting go, that relinquishment, that kenosis. He says once that is performed, that's like the only doorway into the second state, which is called inspiration. And this is when you're suddenly filled by objective content from the spiritual world. Whereas before in imagination, it was purely subjective.
Yeah, no, I like that. I mean, it reminds me of William Blake as well, where he talks about the difference between seeing with and seeing through the eye. And so the analogy he often uses that when you look out of a window, you look through the window. You don't look at the window. You don't sort of admire the pane of glass. You realize that there's an image coming to you through the glass, and so you take the image through the glass. And he says that our sense perception, we need to regard it in the same way. That our sense perception is with the eyes of the imagination. The appearance is speaking of a wider reality, a deeper reality, and so practicing being receptive to that. But as you say, Blake will then also say, one man's tree is an object in the way, and another man's tree is a beautiful green living thing, and another man's tree is the home of the dyad, or whatever it might be. But all that must be let go in order to receive, the object life as well. And it's a sort of both and, I think, in Blake. Fourfold vision, as he would put it, is both. It's to be able to see these things at all levels, but again, a sort of expansive sense of things. So maybe rather than I don't know, it's not quite a letting go in Blake. It's a sort of more sitting lightly with it. Kissing the joy as it flies is, one of the ways that he puts it. Or, how do you know but that every bird that cuts the airy way is an immense world of delight enclosed by your senses five. So you need, as it were, to use the senses five to spot the bird, but then to enter into the immense world of delight that the tangible is communicating to you as well, if that makes sense.
Lord us keep from single vision and Newton sleep.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think it's just right. And I would just point out again, what we're doing is trying to provide phenomenological descriptions for something that, many of us probably have had at least some inkling of experience, and then others have had much more experience. And these are the people that we regard as teachers. But I don't think it's a question really of quibbling over who's correct. It's a question of they both tried to provide descriptions, like they're both articulating this certain experience. And then it's for us to try to do what they're saying, which is not get hung up on the words, but actually see through the words to what they mean.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful comment. I appreciate that. I think part of my stumbling block with Steiner is you can hear the claim that it's Steiner's way and is the only way. whereas I'm, looking for analogous paths. And so,
But
I'm glad
in a
that
way, it is though. Like in a way, every path is the only path because they're describing things what seems like different ways, but there's one path, and that's towards Christ.
Landon, do you want to chip in anything further? We might begin to draw to a close, but do you want to pick up on anything?
I don't think so. I was just thinking earlier about this beautiful passage in poetic diction, and I can't remember who Barfield is quoting, but he quotes him at length. And it's talking about how you see all these men who will spend a lifetime in their studies chasing that old feeling they got when they read a certain poem that brought about this felt change of consciousness. And they'll memorize it. Those words will always be on their tongue, yet they lose their life. And it's only in the letting go of it that that renewal can ever happen. And I just thought of that as one example of many, how we see that sort of kenosis, not just in used as an abstract idea to complete a cathedral of abstract ideas that Barfield's putting together, but sort of deeply woven into the fabric of his thought, that there's always this idea that the corn of wheat has to fall to the ground and die before it can bring forth any fruit.
Yeah, no, well put. I mean, my mind often goes to Dante in these things. I find him so helpful because he has these such vivid images. And Barfield and Lewis read Dante many times, and I take it that part of the reason why Dante had to see Lucifer frozen in the floor of hell was because Lucifer had been a seraph, for being the beings closest to the divine, but had, even in that blissful state, had tried to seize that being for himself, sort of hold on to it, a bit like the poet trying to remember the line of the poem that lifted them once, rather than entering the life itself. That was kind of Lucifer's terrible mistake, and Dante has to see that if he's going to rise too. To know very vividly through this encounter what that error might be like. Hey, look, maybe we draw to a close. We've been talking just over an hour, which has been a joy, and I've found this helpful. Thank you. I think it's worth returning to this notion of final participation, picking up the threads that Barfield gives us, expanding it in the ways that others have taken it, even if with different language, and through the sharing, as you said there, Max, just with luck, raising it that little bit more into our consciousness, and I hope perhaps people who've been listening as well.
Thanks for having us.
Great. Well, look, we'll speak again, I hope, at some point, and continue.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. We really appreciate you having us on, and I appreciate both of you for this conversation. I think it's right that Novalis has a quote. He says, "Love is the Amen of the universe," and that's really the only way to think of this. If you, in the fullest way, the most complete way, it's like we are like, love is what allows for unity without abolishing individuality, and that's really what we're seeking here.
Yeah, well said, well put. Thank you very much. On that note, here's to the next time. Cheers for now.